Marco's hands trembled as he stood outside the small cafe in Barcelona's Gothic Quarter, staring through the window at a man he hadn't seen in 17 years. His father sat at a corner table, gray hair catching the afternoon light, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup like it might anchor him to the earth. The sight made Marco's chest constrict, a physical pain that stole his breath. He'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, imagined all the things he'd say, or the anger he'd unleash. But now, faced with the reality of it, he found himself frozen, unable to move forward or turn away. Just 3 months ago, Marco had been a different man entirely. He'd stood in his architecture firm's sleek glass conference room, tailored suit sharp enough to cut, watching the Barcelona skyline stretch endlessly before him. He'd felt invincible then, master of every conversation, conqueror of every social interaction. His colleagues had gathered around during lunch break, the usual Friday ritual of stories and laughter, when Marco had made the declaration that would change everything. 10 minutes, he'd said, leaning back in his chair with that trademark confidence that made people either love him or hate him. Give me 10 minutes with any woman in this city, and she'll remember me forever. The words had rolled off his tongue so easily, backed by years of successful charm, countless easy victories in Barcelona's social scene. He'd seen the way people looked at him, the way conversations shifted when he entered a room. He'd believed his own mythology. Diego, his business partner and the only person who'd known him long enough to see through performance, had raised an eyebrow. Diego was everything Marco wasn't. Quiet where Marco was loud, thoughtful where Marco was impulsive, content where Marco constantly needed validation. They'd built their firm together from nothing, two architects with different visions that somehow complemented each other perfectly. But in that moment, Diego's expression had held something Marco couldn't quite read. A challenge, maybe, or pity, any woman. Diego had asked, his voice carrying that calm certainty that always unnerved Marco slightly. Any woman, Marco had confirmed, spreading his hands wide. It's all about reading people, knowing what they want to hear, giving them that moment of feeling seen. 10 minutes, maximum. Diego had nodded slowly, as if considering a complex architectural problem. Then prove it, he'd said simply. There's someone I want you to meet. Her name is Julia. If you can make a real connection with her, not just charm her, but actually connect, I'll admit you're right about everything. The way Diego had emphasized the word real should have been Marco's first warning. But he'd been too confident, too sure of himself to notice. He'd agreed immediately, already planning his approach, already composing the perfect opening lines in his head. He'd even felt a thrill of excitement at the challenge, like an artist preparing for a performance. The meeting had been arranged for the following Tuesday at Park Güell, early morning when the tourist crowd was still sparse and the light-painted Gaudi-esque mosaics in soft gold. Marco had arrived 15 minutes early, positioning himself strategically near the main terrace, watching the entrance. He'd worn his favorite jacket, the one that made his shoulders look broader, had his hair styled just casually enough to seem effortless. Everything had been calculated, prepared, perfect. Then he'd seen her. Julia had walked into the park with a sketchbook under her arm, completely absorbed in the world around her. She'd moved with a kind of presence that wasn't about attracting attention, but about being genuinely engaged with her surroundings. Her dark hair had been pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup that he could see, wearing jeans and a paint-stained canvas jacket that looked like it had stories to tell. She'd settled onto a bench facing the famous mosaic salamander, pulled out her sketchbook, and immediately become lost in her wake. Marco had approached with his usual confidence, his opening line polished and ready. That's a very unique perspective you're capturing, he'd said, gesturing to her sketch. Most people just photograph it. You're actually seeing it. Julia had glanced up, her brown eyes meeting his with a directness that had immediately thrown him off balance. There had been no flutter of eyelashes, no pleased smile at the compliment, no opening for him to slide into. Instead, she'd studied him for a long moment, as if reading a text written on his face, before saying, "That's a very rehearsed introduction." The words had hit him like cold water. "Excuse me," he'd managed, his smile faltering. "You've said that before, haven't you? To other people." Julia had set down her pencil with deliberate care, giving him her full attention in a way that felt more like an examination than engagement. The comment about perspective, the observation about seeing versus photographing. It's good. I'm sure it usually works. Marco had felt his carefully constructed approach crumbling. He'd tried to recover with wit, with charm, with a quick thinking that had always saved him before. But Julia had simply listened with that same direct, unflinching gaze, and then she delivered the blow that would haunt him for days. "I'm going to save us both some time," she'd said, her voice kind but firm. "I'm not interested in performance art. If you want to have a conversation, sit down and tell me something true. If not, have a nice day." She'd returned to her sketching, dismissing him as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Marco had stood there, frozen in the middle of Park Güell, while tourists flowed around him like water around a stone. No one had ever done that to him before. No one had ever seen through him so quickly, so completely, and then simply walked away from the performance. He'd felt exposed in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood, like someone had stripped away his armor and left him standing naked in the Barcelona morning. He'd left without another word, his pride wounded but something else stirring beneath it. Curiosity, maybe, or the first uncomfortable tremor of self-awareness. That night, alone in his minimalist apartment overlooking the Mediterranean, Marco had found himself unable to stop replaying the encounter. He'd tried to analyze it like he analyzed everything, looking for the tactical error, the moment where his approach had failed. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized Julia hadn't rejected his approach. She'd rejected the entire premise of what he was doing. She'd seen him performing and had simply refused to be an audience. Diego had texted him that evening. How did it go? Marco had stared at his phone for a long time before typing back. Fine. We're meeting again. The lie had tasted bitter, but he hadn't been ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Not when he could still feel the sting of Julia's casual dismissal, the way she'd returned to her sketching as if he was nothing more than a temporary interruption. For 3 days, Marco had tried to convince himself he didn't care. He'd gone about his usual routines, morning runs along the beach, client meetings where his charm worked exactly as it always had, evening drinks where women still laughed at his jokes and leaned in when he spoke. But Julia's words echoed in every interaction. "I'm not interested in performance art." And once he'd heard it, he couldn't unhear it. Every compliment he gave, every witty observation, every carefully crafted response began to feel hollow, scripted, false. On the 4th day, he'd found himself back at Park Güell. He'd told himself he was just going for a walk, but his feet had carried him directly to the bench where Julia had been sitting. And there she was again, same spot, same sketchbook, same complete absorption in her work. The morning light caught the concentration in her face, the slight furrow between her eyebrows as she worked to capture something only she could see. This time, Marco hadn't prepared an opening line. He'd simply walked up and said, "I'd like to try again. Differently." Julia had looked up, and for the first time, he'd seen something other than dismissal in her eyes. Interest, maybe, or possibility. "Okay," she'd said slowly, "but I have one rule. Every question you ask me, you have to answer yourself first." "Deal." "Deal." Marco had agreed, even though the prospect terrified him in ways he didn't fully understand. Julia had gestured to the bench beside her, and Marco had sat, suddenly aware of how close they were, how the morning breeze carried the scent of her soap, something clean and simple, no heavy perfume, no artifice. She turned to face him, sketchbook closed in her lap, and asked, "Why do you do architecture?" The question had seemed simple enough, but Marco had found himself stumbling over the answer. His prepared responses about passion and vision and creating beauty had felt inadequate under Julia's steady gaze. So instead, he'd said something he'd never admitted to anyone. Because buildings don't leave. You design something, and it stays. It's there, solid and permanent, long after you're gone. Everything else in life is temporary, but architecture endures. Julia had nodded slowly, and he'd seen understanding flicker across her face. "My town," she'd said. "I do art because it's the only time I feel completely honest. When I'm drawing, I can't lie. The pencil shows everything, every hesitation, every certainty, every truth." They talked for 2 hours that morning, and then met again the next day, and the day after that. Over 3 weeks, something had shifted in Marco that he couldn't quite name. With Julia, He'd found himself speaking without calculation, responding without strategy, existing without performance. She'd asked him questions that peeled back layers he'd spent years constructing, and she'd listened to his answers with a focus that made him feel truly seen for the first time in his adult life. If you're finding this story resonating with you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. This is just the beginning of Marco's transformation. One evening, they'd walked along Barcelona beach as the sun set over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The sand had been cool under their feet, the city's noise fading to a distant hum behind them. Julia had stopped walking, turned to face the water, and asked the question Marco had been both dreading and anticipating. "Why do you do it, Marco?" The charm, the performance, the constant need to be impressive. The question had hung in the salt air between them, heavy and unavoidable. Marco had felt his throat tighten, felt the familiar urge to deflect with humor or change the subject with cleverness. But he'd made a promise to Julia, to be honest, to be real, and something in him desperately wanted to keep that promise. "My father left when I was 9. He'd said, the words coming out rough and unsteady. He'd stared at the horizon, unable to meet Julia's eyes. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had football practice after school. I came home, and his things were just gone. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. He just didn't come home one day." Julia had waited, not filling the silence with empty sympathy or meaningless reassurances, just standing beside him as the waves whispered against the shore. "I think I spent my whole life trying to prove I was worth staying for," Marco had continued, the confession spilling out now, unstoppable. "If everyone likes me, if everyone wants me around, if I'm charming enough, impressive enough, perfect enough, then maybe I won't be left again. Maybe I'll finally be enough." "Maybe you won't be left again," Julia had echoed softly, finishing the thought he couldn't quite articulate. Marco had nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. It was the first time he'd said any of this aloud, the first time he connected his father's abandonment to the person he'd become. And standing there with Julia on that Barcelona beach, he'd felt something crack open inside him, something painful and necessary and terrifyingly real. Julia had reached out and taken his hand, her fingers warm and solid in his. She hadn't said anything, hadn't tried to fix him or comfort him with platitudes. She just held his hand and stood with him as the sun disappeared and the stars began to emerge, and somehow that had been exactly what he needed. That night, lying awake in his apartment, Marco had made a decision. He'd avoided his mother for nearly a year, their relationship strained by a silence neither of them knew how to break. But Julia's questions had opened something in him, a need to understand not just his own pain, but the pain his family had carried together, separately, all these years. His mother, Carmen, lived in a small apartment in Barcelona, close enough to the sea that she could hear the waves at night. Marco had arrived unannounced on a Sunday morning, his heart hammering as he climbed the familiar stairs, knocked on the door he'd once run through as a child. When Carmen had opened it, her face had cycled through surprise, wariness, and finally a tentative hope that broke Marco's heart. "Marco," she'd said simply, stepping aside to let him in. The apartment was exactly as he remembered, neat, modest, filled with the scent of coffee and the sound of a TV playing softly in the background. They'd sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where Marco had eaten breakfast as a child, where his father had read the newspaper on Sunday mornings, where their family had existed before it fractured. "I need to talk to you about Papa," Marco had said, the words coming out harder than he'd expected. "About what happened. About all of it." Carmen's hands had tightened around her coffee cup, her knuckles white. For a long moment, Marco had thought she might refuse, might shut down the conversation the way she always had. But then she'd looked at him, really looked at him, and he'd seen his own pain reflected in her eyes, magnified by years of carrying it alone. "You look like him, you know," she'd said quietly. "Every day, more and more. Your smile, the way you stand, the way you gesture when you talk. Sometimes I look at you and I see him walking out that door, and is that why you can barely look at me?" Marco had asked, the question he'd wondered about for years finally spoken aloud. Carmen's eyes had filled with tears, her careful composure crumbling. "It's not fair to you," she'd whispered. "I know that. But every time I see you, I see him leaving. I see him choosing to walk away from us, from you, from everything we'd built. And I'm so angry. Marco, after all these years, I'm still so angry." "So am I," Marco had said, and suddenly they were both crying, years of unspoken grief and rage spilling out across that kitchen table. Carmen had reached across and taken his hands, holding them the way she used to when he was small and afraid of the dark. "He destroyed something in both of us," Carmen had said, her voice breaking. "And we spent all this time avoiding each other because we remind each other of what we lost. But you're not him, Marco. You're better than he ever was. You're stronger, kinder, more brave. And I'm sorry I couldn't see that. I'm sorry I let my pain blind me to you." They'd held each other and cried, and for the first time in 17 years, Marco had felt connected to his mother in a way that wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was messy and painful and honest, and it felt like the beginning of something real. But then Carmen had said something that changed everything. "He wrote to me," she'd said quietly, pulling back to look at Marco. "Last month, after all this time, after all this silence, he wrote to me. He wants to see you, Marco. He wants to meet." The words had hit Marco like a physical blow. "What?" he'd managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "He left a number, an address." Carmen had continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket, as if she'd been carrying it, waiting for this moment. "I wasn't going to tell you. I didn't know if I should. But you're here now, and you're asking questions, and I think maybe you need to know." Marco had stared at the paper like it was a bomb, something that could explode and destroy everything he'd been rebuilding. His hands had shaken as he'd taken it, his father's handwriting, a script he'd once known as well as his own, now foreign and strange after 17 years of absence. That night, he'd called Julia at midnight, unable to sleep, unable to stop his mind from racing through every possible scenario. She'd answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep but immediately alert. "Marco? What's wrong?" "He wants to meet," Marco had said, pacing his apartment in the dark. "My father. After 17 years of nothing, he suddenly wants to meet. And I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell, to let him feel what it's like to be ignored, to be abandoned. But part of you is still 9 years old, waiting by the window," Julia had finished softly. "Yeah," Marco had admitted, his voice cracking. "I hate that part of me. I hate that after everything, after all this time, I still want his approval. I still want him to tell me it wasn't my fault, that I was enough, that he shouldn't have left." There had been a long silence on the line, filled only with the sound of their breathing. Then Julia had said, "You don't owe him anything, Marco. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even your time. But maybe you owe yourself the chance to stop wondering. Maybe you need to look him in the eye and see that he's just a man who made terrible choices, not some ghost that haunts every relationship you'll ever have. Will you come with me?" Marco had asked, hating the vulnerability in his voice but unable to hide it. "If you need me to," Julia had answered without hesitation, which was how Marco found himself standing outside a cafe in the Gothic Quarter 2 weeks later, his heart racing, his hands trembling, staring through the window at the man who had shaped his entire life through absence. Julia stood beside him, her hand warm in his, not pushing him forward or pulling him back, just present, solid, real. "I can't do this," Marco had whispered. "Yes, you can," Julia had said firmly, "and I'll be right here when you're done." Marco had taken a deep breath, squeezed Julia's hand once more, and walked through the cafe door. The bell chimed softly, and his father looked up, their eyes meeting for the first time in 17 years. Tomas stood slowly, awkwardly, his face a mirror of uncertainty and hope and fear. He'd aged, Marco saw. The man who'd left had been young, vital, confident. This man was gray, worn, diminished somehow. "Marco," Tomas had said, and his voice cracked on the name. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Marco had replied, sitting down across from his father because his legs suddenly felt unsteady. Up close, he could see the similarities Julia had once pointed out, the same nose, the same jawline, the same hands. It was like looking at a ghost of his future self. They'd ordered coffee neither of them drank, the cups growing cold between them as silence stretched taut and uncomfortable. Finally, Tomas had spoken. You look good. Strong. Your mother says you're an architect now, that you have your own firm. Don't, Marco had said sharply. Don't do small talk. Don't pretend you know anything about my life. You gave up that right 17 years ago. Tomas had flinched but nodded. You're right. I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this. I don't know what to say. How about starting with why? Marco had demanded, years of anger suddenly flooding through him. Why did you leave? Why did you never call, never write, never once check to see if I was okay? Do you have any idea what you did to me? To us? I was 26, Tomas had said quietly, his hand shaking around his coffee cup. I was terrified. Your mother and I, we were drowning in bills, in responsibility, in all these expectations I didn't know how to meet. I felt like I was failing at everything, as a husband, as a father, as a man. And one day I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see any way forward. So I ran. That's not an explanation, Marco had said, his voice cold. That's a coward making excuses. You're right, Tomas had agreed, tears sliding down his weathered face. I was a coward. I am a coward. I thought leaving would make it easier for everyone. I thought you'd be better off without me dragging you down. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I know now I was just scared. And by the time I realized what I'd done, by the time I understood what I'd destroyed, too much time had passed. I didn't know how to come back. I didn't think I deserved to come back. You don't, Marco had said flatly. You don't deserve anything from me. I know, Tomas had whispered. But I needed you to know that it was never about you, Marco. You were perfect. You are perfect. Every day I was gone, I thought about you. Every birthday, every milestone I missed, I thought about you. You have to believe me. Why? Marco had asked, and his voice had broken on the word. Why should I believe anything you say? You had 17 years to reach out, to apologize, to try. Why now? Why do you suddenly care now? Tomas had looked down at his hands, old and scarred from years of manual labor. Because I'm dying, he'd said simply. Cancer. Maybe 6 months left. Maybe less. And I couldn't leave this world without trying to tell you the truth, without trying to make you understand that my leaving had nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own weakness. The words had hung in the air between them, final and terrible. Marco had felt something crack inside him. Not sympathy, exactly, but a kind of exhausted acceptance. His father was dying. All the anger, all the waiting, all the questions would die with him. This was it. This was all there would ever be. I can't forgive you, Marco had said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. I don't know if I ever will, but I can stop letting you haunt me. I can stop building my entire life around proving I was worth staying for, because it was never about worth. You were just broken, and you broke us trying to fix yourself. Tomas had nodded, accepting the words like a sentence. That's more than I deserve, he'd said, more than I had any right to hope for. They'd sat in silence for a few more minutes, and then Marco had stood to leave. At the door, he'd turned back one last time. His father sat slumped in his chair, looking older than his years, diminished by regret and illness and time. Goodbye, Papa, Marco had said, and walked out into the Barcelona sunshine. Julia had been waiting across the street, exactly where she'd promised to be. When she'd seen Marco's face, she'd crossed to him immediately, pulling him into an embrace. Marco had held her tight, breathing in her familiar scent, grounding himself in her solid presence. Are you okay? She'd asked. No, Marco had said honestly, but I will be. They'd walked along the narrow streets of the Gothic Quarter, not talking, just being together. Marco had felt hollowed out, exhausted, but also strangely lighter, as if he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Meeting his father hadn't given him closure. The conversation had been too messy, too unresolved for that. But it had given him something else, permission to stop waiting, to stop wondering, to stop building his entire identity around an absence. Over the following weeks, something shifted in Marco that everyone noticed but no one commented on directly. At work, he listened more and performed less, his ideas becoming more collaborative, more genuine. He started having weekly dinners with his mother, building a relationship based on honesty rather than avoidance. Diego had watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, never once saying, "I told you so," though the knowing smile he sometimes wore suggested he was thinking it. And with Julia, Marco discovered what it meant to be truly seen and loved not for his performance but for his authentic self, scars and all. They spent evenings on his rooftop terrace, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in both conversation and silence. He'd learned to ask questions and actually listen to the answers, to share his own thoughts without calculating their impact, to exist without armor. One evening, as the sun set over Barcelona and painted the sky in shades of fire, Julia had arrived at his apartment for dinner. They'd eaten on the terrace, the city spread out below them like a living painting. As they finished their wine, Marco had taken a deep breath and said, "I need to tell you something." Julia had set down her glass, her expression open and patient. "Okay." The first time we met, Marco had begun, the words difficult but necessary. It was a bet. Diego challenged me to prove I could make a real connection with you. That's why I approached you that day in the park. That's why I tried so hard to impress you. It wasn't genuine. It was a game. He'd watched Julia's face carefully, bracing for anger or disappointment. But instead, she'd smiled, a small, knowing smile that made his heart skip. "I know," she'd said simply. "What?" Marco had stared at her, shocked. "Diego told me before he introduced us." Julia had explained, reaching across the table to take his hand. "He was worried about you, Marco. He saw how you were living, always performing, never connecting, building walls with charm and wit. He thought you needed someone who wouldn't play the game, who'd force you to be real. So he asked me if I'd be willing to meet you, knowing what it was. And I agreed because I was curious about what would happen if someone simply refused to be impressed." Marco had felt his world tilt. "You knew the whole time? All those conversations, all those moments, you knew it started as a bet?" "I knew how it started," Julia had said, squeezing his hand. "But I also watch you change. I watch you move from performing to being present, from trying to win to trying to understand. You didn't change because of the bet, Marco. You changed because you wanted to, because you were ready to." "I'm sorry," Marco had said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I started this whole thing with a lie." "You started with a lie," Julia had agreed, pulling him closer. "But you stayed for the truth. And that's what matters." They'd kissed then, standing on the terrace as Barcelona glowed around them, and Marco had felt something settle inside him. A peace he'd spent his entire adult life chasing through charm and conquest and performance, only to find it in the simple act of surrender, of allowing himself to be known and loved exactly as he was. If this story moved you, if Marco's journey resonated with something in your own life, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from and share your own experiences with vulnerability and transformation. And please, hit that like button and subscribe so we can continue sharing stories that matter, stories that remind us all that true strength isn't found in conquest but in the courage to be real. Thank you for watching, for staying until the end, for being part of this community. Until next time, remember that sometimes losing is the only way to win what truly matters.